Thank you for having me, and for those of you that do this in very important work of helping and mentoring inmates, I applaud you. You can get your heart broke, as you know, and you can get some wonderful satisfaction from doing it. And as you all know, 97% of our inmates come back into our communities, and so what you do is to be applauded. Jerry mentioned it before. I got my job in the worst possible way. My predecessor was assassinated, but there's a bit more to it than that. That's Mr. Clements. He had retired after 30 years with the Missouri Department of Corrections. Governor Hickenlooper hired him, and he'd been there for a very short period of time, less than 2 years. When he got there, he found that solitary confinement was being overused. And at that time, in 2011, there were about 1,500 inmates in solitary confinement or segregation or administrative segregation or punitive segregation or restrictive housing or the whole or whatever you want to call it. And he began to reduce those numbers. Unfortunately, an individual who had spent 7 years in solitary and had some mental health issues, was a member of a white supremacist gang, was released directly from the community, or from segregation into the community. Behaved himself for a while, then cut his bracelet off. The alarm went off for 6 days and no one from parole answered the alarm. And during that time, after Mr. Ebel got his hands on a handgun, he ordered a pizza. The media called the gentleman that delivered it a pizza deliverer. His name was Nathan Leon. He was a father of 3, had a second job to try and improve his family's life. After Mr. Ebel had him tape a rambling statement about the horrors of solitary confinement, he shot and killed him, took his uniform, took the pizza box, threw him in the trunk of the car, went to Mr. Clements' residence, rang the doorbell. Mr. Clements answered the door. He was shot in the chest and died in his wife's arms. Later, Mr. Ebel was killed in a shootout in Texas after he had shot a Texas officer in the face who had survived. To finish the perfect storm, it was determined that, oh, by the way, with a clerical error, Mr. Ebel was let out 4 years early. You know, I've had a number of different professions. Reverend Hancock mentioned some of them. I've also been an assistant district attorney and assistant U.S. attorney. Heck, I was even a tax appeals commissioner. I won't even get into that job. And I'd like to, one, apologize if I use a few obscenities, but sometimes I get passionate and let something fly. But the other is when you listen to what I have to say, I want you to ask yourself a question. And I've asked myself this question, and understand I don't like bureaucracies. And I've led some, I've belonged to some, I've been in public service most of my life, and I simply do not like bureaucracies. And the reason I don't is because things somehow become acceptable. And when they become acceptable, they're taught and they're approved and they're done. So ask this question. At what time did it become okay to lock someone up in a 7 by 13 foot cell or less 23 hours a day for over 20 years? And at what time did it become okay to lock someone for 23 hours a day in a 7 by 13 foot cell that's mentally ill for years and let the demons chase them around in that cell? And at what time did it ever become okay to lock someone in a segregation cell 23 hours a day for years and then release them directly into the community? And when I got to Colorado, I heard stories of 2 officers, and as you saw, it's always 2 officers escorting someone in segregation, taking someone out of a solitary cell that they'd been in for years, having them in manacles, putting them in street clothes, putting the manacles back on, and I'm talking belly chains, leg chains, arms secured, you saw the inmates shuffle with those manacles on, taking them out, putting them on a public bus, taking the shackles off, and getting off the bus. And if I were that bus driver, I'd stand up and scream at the top of my lungs, "Run!" What could we possibly be thinking about? And when I made that statement at a national meeting of my peers, one of my peers said, "Well, at least you put them on the bus, we just shove them out the door." I told my staff that we have lost sight of our mission. And I said, "Do you mean to tell me that we take someone that we think is too dangerous to be in a maximum security general population prison, being supervised by those that are trained to supervise them, yet we release them directly into the community?" When did that ever become okay? And what I've said is that the overuse of segregation is to run a more efficient institution. You got a guy with a big mouth, you got a guy that acts up, doesn't follow the rules. I call it the steel door solution. You throw him in a cell, you slam the door, and you walk away. Now, mind you that running an efficient institution is a very noble goal. That's not our mission. Our mission's public safety. And if we're sending someone out worse than they're coming in, we've lost sight of our mission. And I said every state in the United States has done that. And we aren't doing it anymore. And my first couple of days in Colorado, I got the wardens together and I said, "Your job's going to get a lot tougher." And I said, "We're going to do these reforms." And then I gave the example that I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, Dane County. I said, in Dane County is a village called Mazomanie, and it's on the Wisconsin River, which is a very wide, swift current, dangerous river. And that a lot of people were drowning in that river, and the villagers in Mazomanie became absolute experts at pulling those drowning victims out of that river. But they never bothered to go upstream to figure out why they were falling in the river to begin with. Of course, then I had to tell them I just made the whole thing up, but the point was, we have to figure out what these solutions are that are causing people to go into segregation to begin with. You ever wonder what it's like for a staff to come to work and that their boss's desk and office is taped off like that? And that was the office that I had to go into and sit at his desk with his budget books and his belongings there. It was a tough, tough job. But leadership starts with me. If I don't buy in to what I wanted to do and what the governor wanted done, and I had the backing of the governor, understand, and you've seen the Willie Horton deals. Everybody has a Willie Horton. When someone does something awful, when you're trying to do reforms, you shut everything down and you make it twice as worse as it was before you started the reforms. Not in Colorado. I am so lucky that it would have been so easy to say, see, these reforms that your predecessor were trying didn't work. He got killed by one of these incredibly dangerous people. We're going to lock everybody up. We're going to get rid of programs. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. That's not the direction they wanted to go. I was hired solely by Governor Hickenlooper to not only finish the reforms that were started, but to surpass them as much as possible, and it starts with me. Our philosophy, hey, 23 hours a day, we control the door. We're the ones that can open it, and we're the ones that can close it. And we began to start saying, just open the door. Jerry wanted me to talk about that night in solitary, and I'll say a little bit about it. You know, there are so many myths that people give to you about solitary. Well, they're for the most violent people. Really. Not if you look at the population that's in there. Some are violent, yes. But some are in there because you're mad at them. And what we've always said is we got to figure out for the whole prison population, not only do we need to figure out who's bad, but who we're just mad at. And the ones we're just mad at, we got to figure something else out. Because putting someone in segregation, I'm convinced in my 40 years in the criminal justice system that it multiplies or manufactures mental illness. And it doesn't solve a problem. At best, it suspends it, and most times multiplies it. So you have someone worse than that person that went in. And so I didn't do that to get in the New York Times. That was the furthest thing from my mind. I did it because we were changing culture the way we had done business for over 100 years. You know, segregation started at Eastern Penitentiary in Pennsylvania by the Quakers back in the 1800s. We're going to isolate these individuals, completely isolate them, and what's going to happen is that isolation will give them time to reflect on their wrongful doings. And once they reflect on that, they'll once again become law-abiding citizens. We all know what happened. Didn't become law-abiding citizens, they went insane. And the Quakers stopped it, and what we did was kept it going. And then during the get tough on crime time, that didn't work. When all these prisons were overcrowded and the riots and the fighting and the beatings were occurring, us, not doctors, not psychiatrists, not nurses, not politicians, it was us. We built supermaxes. And if we would have asked doctors, in fact, I was on a panel where a doctor said, you know, if that were a drug and had to go through the process of being approved through the Food and Drug Administration, it wouldn't have made it past the first step. And then I was on another panel, I've been on a lot of panels, where some neuroscientists were speaking, and one of kind of the secondary comments he made, he said they use rats when they deal with studying isolation because they are not allowed, because of their profession, to have experiments with incarcerated individuals. So they use rats. And he said, you know, when we use rats for these experiments, we need to get approval from the government to house them in a single cage. So we treat rats better than we treat humans. It's something to think about what we're doing. And when I talk to my recruits, and I talk to every class, I tell them, I don't need you to question authority, especially mine, because we have good supervisors. But I need you to do what I did when I got to Colorado. And what I did was I took a look around and I started asking myself these questions, and I thought, what the hell are we doing? I mean, how can we treat people like this? And when you talk bureaucracies and when things get accepted, and I mean, this is one of the best organizations that I've ever had the opportunity to lead. They're incredibly professional, they're good, and we've been teaching them the wrong thing for years. To the point where even our clinicians, who their whole job is to help people, that's what they do. That when I started asking questions, when someone was telling me about someone who is severely mentally ill, that was kept for years because he was so disruptive and solitary, and as a result of that, began to smear his body fluids all over the wall. I said, did he do that every day? Yeah. Does he do it every waking hour? Pretty much. Does he do it when he's outside the cell? No. Why don't you let him out of the cell? But that's the problem with bureaucracies when conduct becomes accepted. My solitary, to finish that, I did that for internal purposes because we were put a newsletter out. To change culture can be difficult. And they'd been doing business for over 100 years the same way. So they had to change. And I thought, well, you know, I've been in a seg cell who knows how many times, but I'd never spent 3 shifts in one as an inmate. And so I did it to write an internal document only, to try and walk the talk, so that when I did say that I thought this was wrong, that it would have some meat to it. Walk the talk sort of stuff. So I went in as an inmate, and you know, more myths about segregation. Well, we can't, this person's so dangerous, we can't have him communicate with anybody because he'll run his criminal enterprise within the prison system. The first thing the warden told me when I was going in, he said, Mr. Raemisch, my dad was Mr. Raemisch. I wish he'd call me Rick, but he didn't. But he said, put your towel at the bottom of the door because there's a 2-inch gap, which I knew. And he said, when the inmates see you coming in, they're going to try and intimidate, threaten, or manipulate you or ask you for things, and they're going to throw a kite to you. A kite's a message on a string. It gets passed from cell to cell till it gets to the cell. You can sit and watch it happen. I thought, well, so much for not being able to communicate. Of course they can communicate. That's what we do. That's what humans do, is communicate. You say we can't, we'll find a way. And that's what they do, is they find a way. So I go in, and what wasn't in the article, naive me, I had to stay up late the night before to prepare for this because I had to get some work done. And so I was up late, and I thought, solitary. What comes to mind in solitary is this quiet, reflecting, lay down, take a 12-hour nap. I bet I got a total of 10 minutes sleep in 20 hours because the noise never stops and the light never goes off. And my staff, as a executive director, I was very proud of them because by policy, they were to check those cells 4 times a shift, and they checked them every half hour. And the way they checked them was, one, you look in this window this big, and then you grab that door and you give it a shake. And you jump through your skin when that happens because you're not prepared for it. So I didn't get any sleep. And it wasn't sensory deprivation, it was sensory magnification, because people screaming, people banging, people trying to communicate all night long. And it was talked a little bit about in the documentary. What you saw was one side of the door. The other side of the door is, can you imagine 8 hours a day for your career going into a place where there's so much stench that you become used to it, that you have to suffer the hearing, watching people smash their faces against the door, that became acceptable? And everything that went along with that, and to do that day after day, to the point where now they're starting to finally do some studies on correctional officers, and it has been found they are 4 times more likely to have PTSD than a returning combat veteran. The study that was done showed that the average life of a correctional officer is 58. And so it's not just about doing something for the inmates, it's about doing something for our staff. And everything that I've done is for a safer community. That's my job. And so if people criticize me about I'm being too soft, and I'll tell you right now, you've all been in prisons. Have you ever found one you like? They all suck. Whether it be a minimum security or maximum security, they're awful. And the reason they're awful is because we're telling you what to do, when to do, why to do it, how to do it, where to do it, all the time. And I might add, then we put them out in the community and expect them to make good decisions. How's that working for us? Now, as a result of that article coming out, and the reason it ended up in the Times was because when I wrote it up, I thought this may have a bit more weight to it than I think. And I gave it to a journalist attached to the governor's office, and I asked him if this had some legs, and he said, oh yeah. And so it ended up in the New York Times. And I didn't realize at the time that no one in my position had ever done that before. And, in the article I said 20 hours, that was a blink of an eye. Nah, it was a grain of sand on a beach. Our people at that time were spending 2.5 years in segregation. I did 20 hours. And after those 20 hours, I didn't have to spend any more time in segregation. I knew that you give me 3 more days in there and I'm going to be throwing everything I got at you. And I'm going to be doing everything I can, because I can only count so many chips in a cell. I can only walk the floor so many times. And I went in as an RFP because I wanted that experience. That's removed from population, which meant I went in with a pen that was about this long, an institutional pen, about as flimsy as a piece of licorice, and some paper that had instructions and directions on it, and I wrote my notes on those pieces of paper. And so the article went to the Times, they accepted it. I knew, of course, when it was coming out. And when it came out, the person from the governor's office called me and said, "Rick, I don't believe it. I've never seen anything like it." I said, "What?" He said, "Virtually every major city in the United States has printed this article." And as Jerry said earlier, my world exploded. As a result of that, I've had some wonderful opportunities to move this vision forward nationally, to testify. I mean, that article, after I testified before a U.S. Senate subcommittee on the overuse of segregation, I was shadowed for a week by New York Times reporter Erica Good, and she and I have since become good acquaintances. After that, I ended up many different places speaking about this, but had the opportunity, the wonderful opportunity, to assist the State Department in Africa and Vienna in helping other countries rewrite the standard minimum of treatment rules for inmates, now known as the Mandela Rules. And it was a fascinating experience, and I got to talk about what we were doing in Colorado. If you saw President Obama's speech, or his written remarks, I might add he's the first standing president that I'm aware of that ever stepped foot in a prison and went to a seg cell. And the minute he mentioned solitary confinement, being a bureaucrat, I knew that before he finished that sentence, there was a committee being formed to start writing about reforms. And there was, and they spent a lot of time in Colorado, and I spent a lot of time talking to him, and a good portion of that report are policies that came out of the state of Colorado. He mentioned us in the report. I'm very proud of what we've done. You can't talk about solitary conform without talking about the mentally ill. You just can't. And the reason you can't is because a good number of states, Colorado included, they are so disruptive that they're put in solitary, sometime for years. Let me tell you a quick story. When I got to Colorado, I was there about a week. My deputy gave me a form. I said, "What's this? I need you to sign it." "What is it?" "Well, the state mental hospital, if they find a patient too dangerous and violent, they can send them to us." I said, "Has he ever been convicted of a crime?" "No." I said, "How many do we have?" "Well, that'll be number 5. And what a coincidence that he had just turned 18, which is the age that they are allowed to send him to us. And he was a big 18-year-old, and he'd been in and out of institutions his whole life, and his dad, when he was 15, would take him to bars to fight, to bet on. So on this form was a box that said yes and a box that said no. I said, "What happens if I check no?" She said, "No one's ever done that before." I said, "Give me a pen." And you can picture this form weaving its way through bureaucracies, and by the time it got to where it was supposed to go, which took, 3-4 days, my phone started ringing off the hook. And then I was told, doesn't matter if I check 1,000 no's, by law, I have to take them. So I did. And do you know what happens when a patient enters a prison? They're treated as an inmate. This gentleman had the mind of about a 5-year-old at best. So if you give a 5-year-old orders, you all know what happens with that. And then my professional staff, following procedure perfectly, this gentleman was getting gassed several times a day. And when I found that out, I went to the governor's office and I said, "This may be constitutional, although that's questionable, but it's immoral and unethical." And I brought over the administrator of Health and Family Services, and they'd never come over to see where these folks had been. And once they saw, because every one of them was in solitary, we were able to pass a law that banned that. So that's over with. That was a big step. Let me quickly give you a breakdown of my inmates. And that's why I've got this slide up here. This is we have 2 institutions that are dedicated to the mentally ill. 30% of my inmates over 30% have some type of mental health problem. Over 12% are what would be classified as seriously mentally ill, and I mean seriously mentally ill. 77% are addicted to drugs, alcohol, or both. On the average, they enter at about the 7th grade education level. And so we had to get the mentally ill out of segregation. I can't think of anything worse than someone with a mental illness being in a small cell the size of a parking lot by themselves. Imagine that. You can't imagine it, but we were doing it, and most states are. So what we did is we developed a residential treatment program. And all of this that you see up here, not only was there no map, there was no road. No one had ever done any of this before. But I felt, and the people that I put in executive positions, if they didn't feel the way I felt, wouldn't have gotten into those positions. So we felt that we were taking the right course. So these residential treatment programs, we call it the 10 and 10 program. Those that had previously been, many of them, in solitary confinement, we started to treat the solution instead of dealing with the problem. And we developed a program where they start out coming out of their cells 10 hours per week for therapy, and then 10 hours per week for other activities. The results have been miraculous. Very simple. Do whatever we can to keep the mentally ill out of segregation. 3 programs, 2 male, 1 female. We try all different types of treatment. I might add that both of our mental health facilities, I banned the use of segregation. One sergeant, very excellent employee, emailed my deputy and said, "You're going to get someone killed." 6 months later, had a professor from Cornell out. He was doing a book on criminal justice reforms, wanted to see what we were doing. Unsolicited, he goes to the sergeant, he goes, "So, are incidences down?" And that sergeant kind of smiled and said, "Yeah." "By how much?" 80%. And that's inmate on staff assaults, forced cell entries, and immobilizing someone with restraints. And incredibly successful. What you see here is part of the 10 and 10 program. Now these are folks that previously would have just sat in segregation. If you look close, and we had to build these tables, that's another part of the map. We got to get these guys socializing, but we also have to make sure they don't try and hurt each other or staff. So they're restrained to those tables, and there's a couple of goals here. Move them along enough so that we can keep them at the table, but take the restraints off. And then once that's done, move them off in the general population. And some are so mentally ill, they'll never leave the residential treatment program, but then the goal is to make sure that we get them out of restraints. All kinds of different therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, cognitive. You know, if you don't know what that means, I'm not a clinician either, but it basically means that anger management programs, thinking programs, self-help programs, trying to get them to be able to control their own emotions, their own thoughts, stop the reactionary stuff and think about the consequences of what you're doing and why you're doing it. One thing we never thought of when we got involved in this business, because obviously, I mean, literally no state had done this but us, is that we had about 200 that wouldn't come out. We had so dehumanized them, they refused to come out of segregation. And I told our staff, and we discussed this, that it would be way too ironic to physically remove someone from a cell we probably physically put them in to begin with. Doesn't make a lot of sense. So what we did was tried what I call at-the-door therapy. Had our clinicians go, now any clinician will tell you therapy out a cell door is not a good way to do business. But under these circumstances, we had no other way to do it, so we did that. And the reason it's not good business, because the last thing an inmate wants another inmate to know is that they're seeing someone for some type of mental health issue. And some don't even realize they have a mental health issue. And so that's the reason why, but we were pretty limited. So, at the door therapy, incentives such as extra canteen items, privileges, that worked. What worked the best with the mentally ill were therapy dogs. We have a very large dog program. And I talked to an individual that had been in segregation for 15 years. He was one that refused to come out, and the therapy dog got him out. And when I was there, he was with the dog, and I said, "Why the dog?" And he said, "It was the only constant thing I had when I was growing up in life." And it had the effects, and we use them still, even though the folks are out now, we use those dogs quite a bit, and the attachments and the emotions between some of these offenders and the animals are terrific. Music therapy, soothing. If it works, you know, you gotta kind of realize this. I'm a hardcore Law and Order guy, all right? And Governor Hickenlooper, you know, he stands up and he says, "We want Colorado to be the worst place to commit a crime, but the best place for a second chance." And I said, "Governor, we're pretty well down the road on that first one, but we got a bit of work to do on the second one." And, but he's a firm believer in second chances. So it was interesting because when I got the job with the internet now, of course, everybody in Colorado Googled me, including my own staff, and all the advocacy groups. And then they go, "Oh, here comes a cop. The reformist executive director is dead, and this cop's going to come in and he's going to turn this place back into the dark ages." And so when I got here and started these reforms, then some of the prosecutors and chiefs and some of the victims groups said, "Oh, he cares about his inmates. All I care about is no more victims." And so if this works for this gentleman, I'm using it. And if it doesn't, I'm stopping it. I don't care if it's to the right of the fence or the left. You know, people like to use this term, and maybe you've used it. I know I've used it in the past. Well, and my employees, they tell this to me. You know, they look at me like, "We'll outlive you. You know, we're going to be here a lot longer than you are." And I go, "Well, maybe, but you're going to be doing what I want while I'm here." And they say, "You know, I've been around when the pendulum has swung to the left, and then I see it swing to the right." And my response is, our job is to make sure that pendulum doesn't swing at all, that it stays right in the middle, where it should be, and we do the right thing. We use the things that work. So everything we do is data-driven. And we keep examples of everything literally that happens so that we can, a bad thing's going to happen, folks. I guarantee it. Because we deal with some bad people. And I've got to be able to show that much worse things were happening, and they were, before we started this stuff, than is happening now. And I've got my facts to prove that already, and it's only been 3 years. So what do you do when you ban solitary and mental health facilities? De-escalation rooms. Soft. They can go in, sit in a comfortable chair, close the door, listen to the music they like. There's some stress balls in there they can write on a blackboard, murals. And instead of exploding on a staff member, they walk up to a staff member and say, "I need a timeout." And they get it. And it works. And assaults are down. And that's our replacement in those facilities for solitary. And we stole it from Human Services. You know, except for in the academy, plagiarism's a great word in corrections. I'll steal anything I can get my hands on, and there's still plenty of things to invent if I want to do that, like we're doing here. But, and trust me, I'm bad at math, but maybe you get this. Health and Family Services believe in their mental health institutions that if they have to use restraints, they have failed. And so they made de-escalation rooms, and they said their use of restraints dropped 400%. I don't know any idea how you get to 400%, but I bought that, you know, and ours have dropped considerably, so we're using it. There's what you see. Special controls dropped 93%. Forced cell entries dropped 77%. Offender on staff assaults, 46%. When people ask if this is a good thing to do, it's a great thing to do. We're doing what we're supposed to be doing. If I have a safer facility and 97% are coming back to live next to you, we've got a safer community. Fewer victims. It's as simple as that. And these were folks that originally would end up in solitary confinement. We were also able to pass a statute working with the ACLU, the legislature, and the governor that in Colorado, except for murder, and even then it has to be something that you can't control, in a serious assault, it is against the law in Colorado to put someone classified as seriously mentally ill into solitary confinement. And what that forces people to do, is quit slamming that door on that steel door solution. You've got to find a solution. You have to deal with it. Our clinicians, they're so professional. They did that 10 and 10 program's now a national model. It works, and it works well. Mandela rules. The fascinating thing about the Mandela rules is that no one in the United States follows them, including me, until I was part of the process and saw these being written for the first time since 1950. 50s. And I would recommend if you have policies in your business that haven't been rewritten since the 50s, you probably ought to take a look at them. But when I watched all these countries in the world, at least those that attended, and many of them did, and you have to, each rule has to be passed not by a majority, but by a consensus vote. And so if one country disagrees with one word in one sentence, they go on. And I was telling a group last night that I didn't go all the way to South Africa to keep my mouth shut. I mean, I went there to advise the State Department, and part of that was grabbing the mic and making a statement about a word that I thought should be in one of the rules. And I got a word in there. I couldn't tell you today what that word is, or where it was, but I'm still so darn proud that I got a word in there, because at 50 years at least, it's probably still going to be in there. But I started paying attention to the Mandela rules, and here's why. There was one other person that I brought with me that made two of us that were involved in corrections doing these changes. Everybody else was a bureaucrat, a diplomat, a lawyer. And I thought, what is the matter with you people? Then I got it. They didn't really care all that much about what I did for a living. They cared about human rights for inmates. In America, we care about constitutional rights for inmates. There's a huge difference there. And so I was grateful that we were able to, in certain areas, just let them know about the rule they were talking about. You know, one of the rules from the 50s said every inmate will work. Yeah, well, there wasn't a lot of programming back in the 50s. And now things have changed. And when they talked about chains need to be banned, they were talking about the ball and chains and some other things that we were aware of. So as a result of what we did, we were able to, we were requested to go to Vienna and try and get these things passed, and we did. And so now I pay attention to them. And part of it is, you've all heard them say that over 15 days in segregation is torture. I think that's an admirable goal to work towards, and I can talk about that a little bit later. That's, again, another one of our facilities that is totally dedicated to those with mental health issues. Now we can talk about a little seg reform. You know, citizens that aren't aware of really what I do for a living, they all want to see a supermax. You know, they've seen them in movies. You just saw a documentary. I got to tell you, that documentary is a supermax. It's any supermax in the country. The director of Virginia, Harold Clark, is a friend of mine. He's very progressive. What the documentary didn't show was the other half of what was going on. That showed the security side of a supermax. The other side of it was he has developed a lot of step-down programs, because you can't just release someone out into general population that spent years in segregation and expect something good to come of it. It's not. You need programs to get them socialized and then start some real programming and then get them out in general population. And Director Clark's doing a lot of that, but this just showed the security side. So that's my supermax. You see nothing. On that documentary, you sure heard a lot, though. And that hearing goes on 24 hours a day. And the tension and the stress and the banging and the screaming and the smell affects you. Not as much as the person behind that door, ever, but it affects those on the other side. You know, I don't know about you, but I don't feel like leaning over a toilet when I use the sink. That's one of our segregation cells. And those actually pretty good for a segregation cell from the ones I've seen. 7 by 13, a lot or less, much less than that. There's our outdoor recreation. How about that? A empty seg cell with a chin-up bar, and you can see the 2 screen slots. Some we have just one. And that gentleman, I might add, when I got there, I found out, and I tell you, every time I go somewhere, I think to myself, why the heck doesn't someone else fix this problem? The problem is, 2 years ago, well, now it's been 5 years ago, that was declared unconstitutional. And which meant that gentleman that I talked to that had spent 15 years in solitary, the sun had never touched his skin. And I'm exaggerating when I say his skin is translucent, but I'm not exaggerating much. So not only do you have to talk about mentally what happens to someone in these cells, but doctors are just starting now to talk about what's happening physically when you're in these cells. Yeah, I had the opportunity to be at a presentation with Mr. Woodfox. Mr. Woodfox spent 40 years in solitary in Angola. And he said, when he gets out in the community, he's been released now, he gets lost, no matter where he is. And the reason he gets lost is because he was looking at something 3 feet away for 40 years, and now when he has extended vision, his eyes can't handle it. Think of that. And what really gets to me, when you wonder, what the hell are we doing? There are a number of states that double cell in a cell the size of a parking lot for 23 hours a day. And I think, well, if this person's so dangerous, what, you're putting one line in with another line? What do you think's going to happen? And I would bet even those of you that brought your partners and spouses and you love each other so much, if I put you in one of those cells for a while, I can pretty much imagine what's going to happen. I know it would happen with me. I wouldn't last very long in there. That's what you see in a supermax. That's all you see. The inmate shuffle and 2 correctional officers. That's what you see today in our supermax. They're out, they're socializing, They're in the gym for the first time. You know, the only reason I can ever think that Supermaxes had gymnasiums were so the staff could use them. Because the inmates never got in them. And if they did, one inmate at one time, what are you going to do in there? You know, do the hokey pokey? I don't know. They're smiling. You know, there are some that would say, well, for the horrible thing they did, they ought to spend the rest of their life in segregation. And I don't try and dissuade them because they're victims that have had horrible things done to them. And I don't try and change what they think. I can't even put myself in their shoes. But what I can say is that by doing this, they're more apt to accept programming, vocational skills, education, and 97% are coming back, and I don't want any more victims. I'll never reach that goal, but that's not going to stop me from trying every single day. Simply, what we try to do in most states is you have the Mandela rules, which are on top, and then you try and do more, because they're just minimum standards, folks. But understand the importance of the Mandela rules, because one thing I did discover is that there's a good number of countries that have no policies other than those rules. And so we're paying more attention to them in the United States now. I've given a number of presentations about them and saying, you better take a look at them, because I know your inmates are reading them, and so you better read them also. Stated before, almost 1,500 inmates out of a population of about 20,000. That was close to 7% of our population per capita nationwide. That was one of the highest in the nation. Today, less than 1%. Lots of things happen when we accept the philosophy. We open the door, we control it. You know, it doesn't have to be 1 hour a day. It can be 4 hours a day. It can be 5. It can be whatever it is that helps to keep these individuals motivated and socialized. What's next for us? You know, you talk about solitary, and we automatically think, most of us, males. But what we've done is realize that take everything I said about isolation and the bad effects, and for females, at a minimum, double it. Because they need more socialization than men. They are closer to their children than men are. And when you cut that off and you break that bond, no good comes of it. When you stop that socialization, and I'll tell you right now, my personal thoughts are that 99% of women in prison are there as a direct result of men. Period. And they're either physically abused, or they're mentally abused, or they become addicted to drugs or alcohol, and they do things for their man, and so they drive that man to an armed robbery and a homicide occurs, and they end up with life in prison. They have low self-esteem, a good number of them, and so why would we make that self-esteem worse by locking them in one of those cells for a lengthy period of time? It's pretty rare for us to ever put a female in solitary. I mean, it really has to be a violent incident, and even then it's just, okay, let's put her in and figure out what happened, and then try and get her out of there as fast as we can. So it's been quite some time since we've had someone in what would be considered the old admin segregation. We got rid of that for them. Here's what we are. Here's where we are right now. We have about, from 1,500, we have anywhere from 130 to 160, maybe a little more, it varies by the day, in segregation, which means we don't need a supermax. So we repurposed the one we did and developed step-down programs in that particular facility. And even our ones that are doing the, quote, 23 hours a day, what we did was we put those other tables you saw outside those cells, and we offered volunteer programming. And the first time we did it, about 12 came out, and now over 100 are coming out. And they're coming out for programming, and they're doing it voluntarily, and what it means is that they're out for longer than 1 hour a day. And I was telling Jerry earlier, a lot of this is built on my philosophy. And this is, I love saying this because now I'm a Coloradoan, is that you've all heard the adage, you can lead a horse to water, but can't make him drink. I don't believe that for a minute. I believe if you pick that damn horse up and you throw him in the pond, they're going to get some water just trying to get the heck out of the pond. And I learned that with some things we did in Wisconsin that were very effective. And we've done some things in Colorado that no other corrections department would even think of doing. Putting all the bad folks together in one area, assaults have dropped by 20%. Put a whole bunch of troublemakers together, not violent, just broke the rules. Quietest unit the warden has. And so you have to try different things because we certainly know what doesn't work. Let's spend a little more time working on things that do work. I drive my staff crazy because I'll turn 180 degrees in 5 minutes. Well, that didn't go over so good, let's try something else. And that's our job. I don't let my directors get comfortable. They get comfortable, then practices become accepted that I talked about earlier. Develop any and all alternatives to restrictive housing. I mentioned a few. There's all kinds of things that we can do other than use restrictive housing. There's privileges that can be taken away. They can spend 8 hours locked down instead of 23. We can limit certain things, canteen items, take their television set away from them, which drives them. They don't like that at all, actually. But it beats the better than long-term isolation. And let me tell you what happens in other states. Whenever I hear, well, they had to work their way into solitary, so now they have to work their way out, I cringe. And here's why I cringe. It's a great concept on its face, but most systems, including Colorado till we got rid of it, has a level system. And that level system is, well, you work your way through level 1 to get to level 2, to get to level 3, to get to level 4. It may take weeks, may take months, may take years, but if you have a bad day in level 3, and I know no one out here nor I have ever had a bad day, you go right back to level 1. And that's how 1 week turns into 1 month, turns into 1 year, turns into 20 years. And the reason they bang and scream and throw things is because they have no idea if and when they are ever going to get out. Ever. More visitation. Anything we can to keep them linked up and socialized. And then something I've just started to work on, and I'll talk about in a minute, is a term I call architectural suffering. Want to buy it? It's empty. I won't deliver it, but you can come and get it. Now picture this. You come over, this is Canyon City. I have 6 prisons there. Picture coming over a hill as an inmate, come over the top of the hill, and that's what you see. Now, I've had 2 times in my life, once as sheriff and recently as executive director, to take my headquartered employees out of absolute dumps and put them into nice office space. And I saw the same thing, which I knew I would see the second time, that I saw the first time. They act better, they look better, they're friendlier, they're happy, and they work harder. And when I walk into a doctor's office, I automatically become a patient because I'm in a doctor's office. And when I'm an inmate and that's what I see, I better become the biggest, baddest inmate there is because that building is going to kill me. And that's what I call architectural suffering, is we've made these prisons, the European prisons, people, even including me in the past, well, it's a different culture. I went to Sweden, visited their system at their invitation. Sweden, population of about 10.3 million. The director there, Nils Oberg, become a professional friend of mine. He has everything. County jails, state prisons, federal prisons. He has it all. 5,000 inmates. Colorado, 5.5 million population. I just have the state prison, 20,000. And I tell people I met a lot of Swedes when I was over there, but they didn't seem much nicer than Coloradoans. What are we doing? You know what? I agree. I'll still say there's a culture difference. That manufactures violence. I'm convinced of that. And until we can treat inmates more like human beings, we're going to have more crime. And if I could tear every single prison down in the state of Colorado, I'd do it in a heartbeat. And it wouldn't look anything like that, I guarantee it.
Is that Florence?
Canyon City, no, Florence is federal, and ADX is federal. That's up the road a bit from it. That's right in Canyon City. Look where we are. People said it couldn't be done. Can't do it, shouldn't do it, too dangerous, too violent. Less than 1% of our population is in our kind of, sort of, maybe segregation. Only state in the nation that we can't place seriously mentally ill and solitary. Only state in the nation where inmates going into solitary know when they're getting out. And that's a maximum of a year, and that maximum is only for those that have committed homicide, sexual assault, or serious assault. We haven't had anybody spend that year in yet, and even now we're debating that. And that includes, obviously, the mental health checks, the regular physical checks, and again, those are the ones that the program tables are out, and it's up to them if they want to come out and socialize and get out longer than that 1 to 2 hours a day. We have not released an inmate from segregation directly to the community since 2014. To do that, and some states are releasing thousands into the community from segregation, and when I got to Colorado, we were releasing half of our inmates from segregation into the community, and I've said, why don't you just stamp return to prison on their forehead and put them out the door because they're coming back. So I talk about this because it can be done, and I'm convinced it can be done anywhere. When you talk about the mission of public safety, how can someone argue against that? How can anybody justify putting someone mentally ill in solitary confinement? How can they possibly justify putting them into the community for years in segregation? That's not our job. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. And that's why I let reporters in, and professors, and journalists, and anybody really legitimate that wants to come in, is to see what we've done. It's miraculous. I get emotional when I go into these facilities to see the difference, the climate difference, the effect on staff. One staff member, a recent article just came out in the Northwest Law Journal, a little bit of me's in there. The majority of the article is interviewing an officer who was dead set against what we were doing and now pushes it and pushes it hard because he's seen the results. And the results is, stop this stuff. I mean, keeping someone in a cell by themselves for years, at what point did we ever think that's a good thing to do? And you know, I kind of chuckle because you know what you hear in a response? Well, our policy says that, and ours I think still says this, so I kind of chuckle more, we'll change it, but says, you know, a person can be put in segregation if they are too violent to be in the general population. That's good. I agree with that. I have 1 out of 20,000. But then there's the next portion of that, or someone who is found to be disruptive to the efficient running of an institution. That's all my inmates. That means I can put anybody I want in there for really any reason, and that's what's happened. And so when I talk to people about, from the Justice Department, U.S. Justice Department, about the Bureau of Prisons and their use of segregation, they said, well, what we hear is they're just the most violent. I said, go take a look. One by one, that's what we had to do. We had to look at every single individual in solitary, and you talk to the correctional officers, you get some amazing answers. Why is he in there? I don't know. Think he can come out? Oh, yeah. You know, I had one for years. He tried to escape, and he's a really good escape artist. In fact, he did escape twice. It's really good. Over a kill fence, he escaped and was recaptured years ago. When I got here, he was still in solitary, and I knew the answer to this. I said, so he escaped, huh? That's why he's in there? Yep. Were the correctional officers that were hired to watch him to make sure he didn't fired? No. Let him out. One that gentleman in for 15 years, you know how he got in there? Well, he verbally threatened to assault a correctional officer. Oh, pretty serious stuff, did he? No. You ever heard anybody? No. Don't you think you ought to let him out? I mean, so when I talked to the Justice Department, I said, take a look at every single one. And then the other thing they said was, well, I'm told the culture is too difficult to change. And I said, I can change that culture for you. I said, there's less than 200 federal wardens. Bring them all together, which I'm not sure if that has been done. I know it hasn't been done lately. They're hiring a new person. You know, the president came out with his basically his orders. You get all those wardens in a room and you say, here's where we're going and here's why. And I want a pilot project so that we can show all of you that this can be done. And if you're interested, raise your hand. And I'll bet they would be surprised how many wardens have been sitting there quietly for years that would raise their hands, because a lot of them don't like this anymore either. I've kept you here for the full load. I appreciate all that you do. I can tell you that now you may see things that aren't moving as fast as you want, but across the nation they're moving. And my belief, at least for Colorado, is that tool is going to be taken out of the toolbox. Because if the only tool in the box is a nail, all you got to use is a hammer. And that's been a problem. So thank you so much, and it's been an honor to be here.
You all have been very patient. If there are a few questions, we'll take the questions.
Thanks. Yeah, I was interested in knowing, are there any longitudinal studies available yet that that can demonstrate, has there been a reduction in recidivism in Colorado institutions as a result of your reforms?
You know, this is all pretty early stuff. So the answer is we're keeping data. We know that I can tell you that those that had been in segregation for a long period of time, that went through our step-down programs and now are in general population, very, very few of them are getting themselves in trouble. You know, we're kind of at a loss of tracking, you know, how do you track someone that would have been released directly into the community that we don't release directly into the community anymore, you know. So, but those programs too, you know, I believe it will show a drop in recidivism. The other thing that we've seen is that another thing we do that not a lot of states do, if any, frankly, is if we have a inmate who has a mental illness and he does a violation, we have a team take a look at whether or not the mental illness caused that violation. If it did, the person is taken out of the discipline process and is put into a treatment program. And if we have someone that's seriously mentally ill that commits a violation, they don't go into the discipline process, they go into a treatment program, and the results are spectacular.
Rick.
Thanks for your work. So it seems like it is working, and thanks be to God. But if you're having to invent these experiments, these salvations that take place in prison, what's going on the street, in the communities of Colorado to prevent folks from showing up there in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, this is a complicated issue. You know, people in my position say, well, we can't control who's sent to us, and we can't. But we can control what is done with that person when they do get to us, and that includes racial disparity. But, you know, let me tell you something. You know, that myth that we deinstitutionalized the mentally ill, what a bunch of crap that was. I mean, all they did was start that walk from the mental health institution into the state prison system. And the reason, and to kind of talk a little bit about it, is because Plan B was never put into place. And Plan B was to fund local government so that they could have programs. And I'm looking around going, where are the healthcare professionals? Why aren't they stepping up to the plate? Because I've got people in prison that shouldn't be there, but they are. And why aren't you accepting your responsibility and stepping up and going, bring them to me? And until that happens, we got a problem on our hands. I was doing some work in Santa Clara County for the sheriff's office. In their jail, 60% of their inmates had mental health issues. 60%. And we allow that to happen as a government, as a community? Step up. You know, that's what I say.
Hello. I was looking at the budget for the Wisconsin Department of Corrections today, and in the appendix it says that they're asking for, I forget, $1 million or $2 million to change the Oshkosh prison to set up a facility for the seriously mentally ill. That's their phrase. What should we be looking for in such a facility that would make it effective?
Well, you know, Colorado was very progressive in about 1995. They dedicated one of those facilities you saw for the mentally ill. But they didn't develop good programs to treat the mentally ill that were in the facility. It wasn't until we developed that 10 and 10 program. So it's great that facilities are dedicated to the mentally ill. I think that's a wonderful idea. You got to make sure, as you say, that you have the right programs. And, you know, my suggestion for everybody in the nation is to use our 10 and 10 program to start out with. Why 10 and 10? I don't know. We had to start somewhere. Maybe it should be 12 and 12, but we'll see. But the program is working right now, and that's a real good place for states to start. A lot of them are taking that and adopting it.
Hi, my name is Dorothy Krause. I have the pleasure of being on the county board on Public Protection and Judiciary Committee. We are currently charged with making some major changes in the Dane County jail system. I'm going to have a hard time, and I need community to back me, because I want them, whatever they decide to do it in community, involving community. It's going to be tough because they want to do what is financially and politically most expedient, and that's not the right answer long term. So we need the community to work together to do what is the best thing for the community and our community members long term. I guess my question would be, how would you look toward convincing the population that's going to pay for this, convincing them that that's the best thing for them to decide to do?
Yeah, you know, Sheriff Mahoney's a friend of mine, and actually I had him send me some pictures of the solitary cells. I was going to use them, and then I thought, that's for a different day. he's been bringing as many people into his facility as he can, and I applaud him for that. It doesn't seem to be making a lot of movement. So you folks understand, when I started as a Dane County deputy sheriff, I think it was 1976. Guess we know whose mind is sharper. Were the exact same seg cells that are there today.
Yes.
Ceramic bunk, stainless steel sink, stainless steel toilet. They're deplorable. And the last conversation I had with Dave is I've been involved in a group funded out of Colorado. They're called the Equitas Foundation, and they're trying to do everything they can in Colorado to start national models of diverting mentally ill from the justice system. And we brought up a judge from Miami-Dade who's done a lot of work in that, been very successful in keeping them out of jail. You know, if you can keep them out, you don't need to do anything with those cells other than use them as a broom closet. But I finally told Dave, and the group I was working with, there were a number of sheriffs there, I said, well, you know what, here's the problem. You wouldn't accept someone coming into your jail with an untreated broken leg. Why the heck are you accepting someone in your jail with a broken mind? And why don't you say you can't book that person in my jail until you take them to the hospital and you get a psychiatric clearance for that individual? And if you don't get one, you keep them there. And that may be the answer, that you may have to force the issue. Because, you know, when I hear like the mental health authorities in Madison, I follow obviously 150 years in Madison, my family, I follow all the politics here. When I hear that law enforcement has to put someone in a car and drive them 100 miles or whatever to get them treated, how's that working for everybody? You know, it's come on, folks, this is a community problem. Don't be dumping it on the jails. And I do everything I can to help the sheriffs, because if the problem's solved there, I don't have one. And so what I would suggest is, Dave's got a ton of horror stories. You know, people are finally starting to care about how people are treated in solitary. They never used to. But I think because of the mass incarceration, and I won't ask everybody in here who knows someone who's incarcerated personally to raise your hand, except me. You know, 1 out of 100 have been in prison or in jail, and those are disgusting, but it's starting to affect the way people think about those incarcerated. And so there's a movement started now. There's an opportunity now, because a lot of people that weren't talking about it before are talking about it now, and I get those pictures of those god-awful seg cells plastered all over the place. And unfortunately for Dave, that's where the mentally ill go. You know, he's got no other place to put them. And those were the same place we put them in 1975 when I worked in the jail. And 76. Maybe it was early 76. But that's, you know, it's tough. You're right. And another thing I've said, and then I'll go on, is that, you know, your difference between European countries and American prisons is that they invest in corrections. We invest in efficiency. And that's why in Europe you'll see staffing that is so heavily geared towards making the inmates succeed versus here, where we may have one correctional officer for 75 inmates. In Europe, the inmates' mentors become staff because there's so many of them. Here, the inmates' mentors become mentors because there's so few of us. And once governments recognize that, and I'll have to say in Colorado that they've done a lot to move in that direction, and we're seeing results for it. But that's what we have as a country have to do.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm really happy to hear about the changes that are coming and the recognition that mentally ill should not be criminalized.
Closer? That's
Better?
Better.
Okay. But my question is about those who, because they're in SEG, become mentally ill. Now, they don't have a documented illness, but mental illness is being created in them because of that. So are those people also being part of the conversations and the activities going on. And I have a son in Waupun Prison now, and I'm witnessing that happening to him, and I'm wondering how I can bring some attention, or if there's anything that I can draw on in regard to that in him.
Yeah, I mean, what we do is we have a fairly constant evaluation process going on, and if we start to see some mental instability, we get them out of there. You know, it reaches a point, and that's why we're having this debate about a year, because at what point does everyone be harmed by being in there? And if there's a certain day, then we're just keeping them in there to make us feel good, and we're having a worse person come out. And so we really gotta think about that, and that's why we're trying to socialize them some more. But you know, there's some states that still, and you saw a bit of that today, if you attempt to commit suicide, you've violated a prison policy, and they put you in solitary. So what's wrong with that picture? Or we use words because we're good at it, like, that person's on suicide watch. Wow, that sounds good. What's that mean? It means we take all his clothes off, we may give him a robe, we sit him in a big glass seg cell, and a correctional officer gets to sit and stare at him as he sits in there by himself. Yikes. You know, I think the more, when it was asked what we can do, you know, every suicide needs to be looked at. Over 90% nationally are in solitary. Self-harm, most of it occurs in solitary. The throwing of body fluids, the banging against the wall, all that occurs in solitary. And so if you want to stop the conduct, you know, self-harm means I want some attention.
Right.
Well, you can give them attention on the front end, which is a lot less than after they grab their eyeball and pull it out, and the money it costs, and they do that. They do everything you can think of and then more. Stop it. I mean, give them the attention. Give them what they need. And you know, you hear things like, we don't have the resources. So that allows you to treat a human being like that? I mean, you better do something. I don't care if you have the resources or not. You got to do something, because you can't treat someone that way. And you can't justify it to a federal judge saying, well, we don't have the resources, Judge, so we're keeping them in there for 37 years. It doesn't work anymore. And so, you know, as I said before, it seems today, everything you do, you got to fight. I mean, I call the utility company or my credit card company, and you just got to fight. And I'd rather not, but I'll fight when I have to.
Yes.
And you got to fight.
There was one amazing moment in that documentary where the mental health professional is being interviewed, and I may have misunderstood, but I thought he said, well, we can't quite figure out, it seems that people who don't have mental illness, when they're put in solitary, develop these symptoms, and we can't figure out if that might be related. Did I hear? Is that what they? Yeah, I thought.
Let me tell you, I am on a lot of panels with a noted psychiatrist who has spent his professional career studying those in long-term isolation. And as he and I were talking, he said, the loneliness that they suffer in long-term isolation, I have found only in one other group of people: terminal cancer patients. Think of that.
Next question.
Mr. Raemisch, or maybe I can call you Rick.
You may.
You have brought some positive feelings with you tonight to all of us who are interested in what happens in Wisconsin prisons. I'm one of Jerry's disciples who goes to prison, and it can be very frustrating to offer some of these uplifting programs that we know will work, and are met with silence. But coming tonight just feels good to know that with patience, persistence, and maybe politeness, things can happen if we are filled with the need to get something done, to be positive, well, here we are, be filled with the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to get us where we need to go in our efforts. But thank you for your message, because even though it isn't perfect in Colorado, it certainly seems to be setting an excellent example for the rest of the country. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you. I don't lose your desire and your drive and your optimism, and it's kind of like, if you don't think one person can make a difference, just think of the mosquito that's in your bedroom at midnight. And, it can make a difference. And so, will it be as fast as you want? It never is. What we did was remarkable, but it still wasn't as fast as I wanted. And there's so much more for us to do, and I talked a little bit about that tonight. But no, what you're doing is so honorable and good. And the fact of the matter is, like I tell my staff, these are people that you're going to be running into at the East Town Mall and the restaurant, and they're going to be cooking for you, and they're going to react to you the exact same way you reacted to them. And so you better start thinking about that, and you better start treating them. It's very simple. All of this is treat them like you want to be treated, and you're going to see such a remarkable difference. And that's why I talk about architectural suffering and giving them ownership. And I could tell you stories about, I'll tell you a quick one. Okay, here we go. I was out at one of my minimum security camps, and whenever I walk through there and I talk to the inmates and I sit down, they've got skills, they've done their time, they're going to get out in less than a year, and I'm thinking, go home. But they can't. So then I start thinking, why don't we put them in civilian clothes those last 8 months and take them out into the community and have them have lunch and stuff with their family and start getting that interaction going, so it's not this bucket of ice water thrown on them. And so I walked up to a correctional officer who has been introduced to me as one of the best correctional officers they have. And you got to picture this place. It's called Delta. It's out in the middle of a desert. There's nothing around it for miles. So I said to her, well, what about if you put them in civilian clothes? Oh, no! Why? Well, once they step, there's no fence around the place, I might add. So, once they step off our grounds, they'll blend into the landscape. And I go, well, where do you think they're going to go? And she's a really good officer, but that's the mindset that we have to kind of change. And then I said, well, had these junky Formica table and those plastic chrome leg stack-em cafeteria chairs that are uncomfortable as heck. I said, well, what about you think we get a decent table and some comfortable chairs? Can't do that. Why? Well, they were told that they can't iron on the table, and they did, and the table's all chipped up. Now, you have to picture what this table looked like before they even ironed, but what was going through my mind, wow, we've got inmates ironing their own clothes? We ought to get them all the darn tables they want. But it's not always easy. You got to keep working at it.
Tom Gilbert, who is one of our most sincere advocates for solitary reform, who's been speaking around the state at our rallies. Give you the last question, Tom.
Okay. I remind Jerry of how much time he's taken out of my life and my wife's because he lassoed us into this crusade, and we appreciate it. We have a son with pretty severe mental illness. He's adopted, and he's on the fetal alcohol spectrum. Spent 5 years in prison. Was in solitary and for 5 months and had a complete psychotic breakdown, and ended up going to WRC for his last year. I tell people that he has moved from being incarcerated to liable to being reincarcerated. And so my question is actually not on solitary confinement. But the other big issue is that now he is liable for reincarceration under what we in the community call crimeless revocation.
Yeah.
And I appreciate all that you presented. I appreciate all that you are doing. It's inspiring. But this is a big problem, that half of the people going into Wisconsin's prison system each year are going without having committed a crime.
Yeah.
And he's now on their second attempt to reincarcerate him. Took him away from a job that he had, and because of his mental, illness issues. And I'm guessing that problem didn't start under Scott Walker's administration. So I'm guessing, and I'm not asking this in an accusatory way, but you were over this system here in Wisconsin, and I'm sure it was going on. So I'm wondering what your perspective on that issue of the mass incarceration, what perspectives you might have as you saw it happening here, and I don't know how it may be in Colorado.
Yeah. I won't talk about Wisconsin. I made a promise to myself. I haven't been there for several years. We're such a small group that if I were to say something that someone would take as being negative, it wouldn't be good for what I'm trying to do. But I will say, I have the same problem in Colorado. I mean, can you imagine? Here's what I ran into. The boss is dead. The alarm went off for 6 days. No one answered it from parole. The newspapers were on them like sharks, ran front page articles for about a week that basically said, the inference was, this department is so incompetent, they got their boss killed. Can you imagine the number of technical parole violations that went up after that? When I got to Colorado, our recidivism rate was 50%. And I've been able to lower that, but it's been a battle. And my parole people, who are good professionals, but they're cops, full arrest powers, guns, khakis. They had polo shirts that said police in small letters on the front, police in large letters on the back. When I took those away, I call them the hoodies. 4 of them got on television wearing hooded sweatshirts with their faces disguised and their voices disguised, saying basically, I was going to get every parole officer killed because I took their shirts away from them. Now, we staff cases with our supervisors. Our recidivism rate has gone down several points, but when I say 50%, new crimes committed within 3 years of release, 13%. That's braggable. The rest were technical parole violations. And like you say, in Colorado, the most you can get revoked for on parole is 180 days. So let me take anyone in this office, this is what I've been trying to talk to my parole officers about, and say, let me take any one of you and put you in that closet for 6 months. Now, you're going to get in a line for treatment that you're not going to get to the front of, even if you volunteer to do it. You're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your home, and your dysfunctional family is going to be more dysfunctional, and then after 6 months we're going to say, try it again. It doesn't work. And so we've developed a number of programs, but I'm being pushed hard on this. I get a letter, an anonymous letter from parole about once every 3 months saying I'm jeopardizing everybody in the state of Colorado. And I had a disaster. And if I didn't have the governor that I had, I probably would have been fired. And here's what happened. I had my division directors present the budget to the legislature in their divisions. I typically would do that, but for succession training, I thought, I'm going to have them do it. I'll sit back, I'll give an opening, they can present their portion of the budget. My parole director at the time was out of state, had an assistant parole director stand up. She went off script. She started talking about an individual that she said was a success story, been able to keep him out of prison even though he's homeless living in a tent behind our Broadway office. once I picked my job, I jumped up and I said, we don't consider someone homeless on parole as a success story, but the success part is we've been able to form partnerships we haven't had in the past with other groups, other providers that are helping us keep him out of prison. This is all on mic, all recorded. 1 week later, he murdered a homeless person. The parole officers that disagree with everything that I want went straight to the media, and that played, and I was fed that for lunch for months. Denver Post editorial, yeah, it's nice to have some reforms, but you're not doing it right, and you're a danger to the state of Colorado. Most governors I would have met my 1.8 professional lifespan, but he understood that bad things are going to happen and supported me on it, and you know, those things happen. And so that's when they start revoking like crazy. We had again, I'm not going to talk about Wisconsin. So,
No, and I didn't
it's
really
just
want
something
you
that,
to, but
I mean, it's something to bring the people's attention. You're right, it overburdens the system, and I'm convinced. That's why in Colorado we developed what we call the Sure and Swift program. It's immediate sanctions for immediate bad conduct. And you do it on a 1 or 2 day period. You can do it on a weekend where they don't lose their job. It gives them I call it shock parole. It wakes them up saying, I better not do that again. It's been very effective.
the law is in place here, the DOC is just refusing to implement it, so.
Tom, I just want to add that there was a minor point, or actually a pretty big point in Rick's presentation, I think that is germane to your question about crimeless revocation. In Colorado, they passed a law saying you cannot put mentally ill people in segregation. That's not DOC policy, that's a law.
Yeah.
In Minnesota, they have a law saying you cannot get revoked unless you commit a new offense. So that's another option, is by statute to say that you cannot revoke somebody. And sometimes, in a perfect world where you had a reasonable legislature, something we only dream about in Wisconsin, that would be a way to address this.
Okay.
Well, and let me tell you what we're facing. And so during one staff meeting, I had one of the executives on parole say, well, we got to revoke this woman. Why? She wakes up and she gets drunk until she passes out every single day. Does she drive? Nope. Refuses treatment, both inpatient and outpatient. And all she does is drink every single day. Refuses everything. Doesn't show up for her office visits because she's dead drunk. Of course she's not going to show up. Do you put her in prison? In my mind, no. She's not committing any crimes. And if she wants to drink herself to death, I can dry her out. But the day she gets out, all I've done is prolonged what she's going to be doing anyway. And so do you put her in prison, or on the outside do you keep trying to reach her, understanding that maybe you can't? But if you can't, prison certainly isn't the place for her. And so, you know, those are some of the dilemmas, and a lot of this stuff, folks, a lot of these revocations, and I hear it all the time, they failed 12 drug tests. Well, people relapse all the time, we know that. We have some programs in Colorado, if you relapse once, they throw you out of the program. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. I mean, you got to accept the fact that humans, we fail, and we succeed. And you got to, it's been shown that when we talk about tough on parolees and probationers, it has been proven that a parolee needs 4 positive incentives when they get 1 negative one to succeed. I mean, it's not, again, it's this hammer thing is, my problem is I've got very professional folks that 70% of them, they're certified law enforcement officers. 70% of my parole officers have some type of law enforcement background. Well, you can't chase bad guys around for 20 years and then go, hey, I'm here to help you. it's tough for them to accept that, and that's the culture that we're pushing. When I won't mention Wisconsin again, but okay, there we go.
Thank you all for coming. I want to close on a very sad note. There were two occasions in Rick's talk when he said, here we do this, here we do that. And of course he was talking about Colorado. If only here were Wisconsin. Thank you very much.